a chill has settled over Beijing's relationships abroad, and increasingly, at home. The last few years were supposed to be China's return to unstoppable momentum. Post-pandemic normalization, a manufacturing supercycle, a green tech export juggernaut, and a slow but steady shoring up of influence from the South China Sea to the Persian Gulf. Instead, China is meeting a coordinated and rising pushback. Tariffs, tech choke points, military balancing, supply chain rewiring, and legal walls going up across democracies. The mood isn't strategic ambiguity anymore. It's strategic enough. The story of 2025 so far is not just that the world is wary of China's rise, it's that governments and companies are operationalizing that wariness into policy, procurement, and posture. And this week delivered a jolt even insiders didn't expect. Today brought an extraordinary sign of internal turbulence. Liu Jianchao, a top Chinese diplomat long floated as a future foreign minister, was taken in for questioning after a recent overseas trip. Authorities searched his home in early August. There's no official explanation. But this is the highest-level diplomatic disappearance since the Qin saga in 2023, and it lands while China needs calm, credible envoys to manage a worsening external environment. The vacuum is the message. Political control first, professional diplomacy a distant second. When your top networker vanishes, the rest of the world notices. Allies, rivals, and global companies all ask the same question. Who's actually steering the ship in Beijing's foreign policy shop? As of today, a deal that would have sounded like fan fiction 2 years ago now looks real. Nvidia and AMD agreeing to hand the US government 15% of revenue from AI chip sales to China in exchange for export licenses. For Washington, it's leverage plus visibility. For Beijing, it's a humiliating reminder that the world's most advanced compute remains gated by US policy. For the chip makers, it's the price of staying in a critical market without blowing up US law. Critics argue it looks like an unconstitutional export tax. Supporters say it threads a needle. Deny China top-tier chips while monetizing and monitoring any allowed flow. Either way, the message is unmistakable. America intends to meter China's access to frontier compute. Pair that with an imminent US-China tariff deadline, markets are literally trading on the clock, and you get a pressure cooker dynamic in which export controls, tariffs, and licensing fees are all instruments of strategy, not just economics. Traders went into today expecting movement around August 12th. The dollar and equities are already reflecting the uncertainty. In Europe, the headline has been EVs. Brussels concluded that Chinese electric vehicle makers benefited from state subsidies that distort competition, and the EU moved from provisional to definitive tariffs last year, then spent 2025 learning a hard truth. Tariffs help, but China Inc. plays the long game. By July, Chinese EV market share in Europe had clawed back above 10%, essentially reclaiming pre-tariff ground, forcing European policymakers to consider floor pricing or other mechanisms. The signal: the EU will not let its car industry be subsidized out of existence without a fight, and Beijing should expect persistent barriers calibrated to blunt the advantage of cheap scale. European skepticism is no longer theoretical panels and white papers. It's policy with line items and customs codes. And while EU strategists keep channels open to manage friction, de-risking has matured from a slogan into procurement rules, screening tools, and contingency plans. Across the UK and Australia, two practical realities have set in. First, critical infrastructure is being scrubbed of Chinese-made surveillance gear, a multi-year process that Whitehall aimed to complete by April 2025, and is still executing as ministries rip and replace cameras and networking guts. This is not empty symbolism. It's a daily grind of contractors, audits, and system downtime, because dependency is finally treated like a security risk, not a bargain. Second, AUKUS is getting both stress-tested and reaffirmed. Washington is reviewing pacing and scope. Canberra and London are signaling they'll push forward regardless. In Australia, that translates into very practical debates. Where you put ports, how you route commercial traffic near naval bases, whether civilian expansion creates choke points an adversary could exploit. The subtext is crystal clear. Defense posture is now a whole-of-society planning problem. If Europe is trade law chess and AUKUS is the logistics arm of deterrence, the South China Sea is where the rubber meets the water cannon, literally. Today, China's Coast Guard said it expelled Philippine vessels at Scarborough Shoal, continuing a pattern of gray zone coercion that's become familiar to anyone tracking the maritime standoffs of the past year. Manila, for its part, is done mincing words. President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. warned that a Taiwan conflict would inevitably pull in the Philippines, not because Manila wants war, but because geography and citizen safety leave no alternative. Beijing called it playing with fire. Marcos called it realism. This week's spike in incidents is precisely why a widening ring of partners, the US, Japan, Australia, India, and increasingly the EU, is stitching together more exercises, Coast Guard tie-ups, and patrols. Beijing labels them external interference. Everyone else calls them insurance. For once, Washington's polarization yields to a bipartisan through line: human rights, transnational repression, and the security implications of tech transfer. Senate bills targeting abuses in Xinjiang, diaspora intimidation, and strategic dependencies signal that Congress won't leave China policy to executive branch deal-making or tariff theatrics alone. The text and pace vary, but the intent is converging. Codify the guardrails so they outlast any single administration. That legislative drumbeat, paired with the executive's tariff brinkmanship and the 15% chip sales skim, forms a pincer: law for the long term, leverage for the short term. Zoom out, and China's macro story in 2025 is a portrait in contradictions. The property sector's long unwind continues. Evergrande's drawn-out liquidation saga is the poster child. While consumer prices are flat year on year, factory gate prices are weak, and officials are trying to manufacture a soft landing for a once red-hot growth model. Youth unemployment has eased from its alarming 2023 peaks, but remains a political pressure point, which is why authorities now publish a modified series that excludes full-time students. The data paint a picture that's neither collapse nor comeback, a grinding recalibration. Ratings agencies flagged these structural constraints well before this summer. Moody's moved China's outlook to negative back in late 2023, citing demographics, property sector downsizing, and long-term potential growth sliding toward the mid-30s. Those weren't hot takes. They were a readout of the math. The upshot for foreign policymakers: Beijing's room to absorb external shocks is not infinite, which makes pressure campaigns more effective and miscalculations more dangerous. The battle isn't only over ships and chips, it's also over narratives and networks. Democracies are drawing firmer lines on where Chinese-linked technologies can sit in their critical stacks: cameras, telecoms, cloud, and even city-level smart systems. That's the UK precedent. Elsewhere, we're seeing messy hybrid skirmishes, social media takedowns, account blocks, and countermoves, as governments recalibrate how to balance speech, security, and foreign influence in the algorithmic public square. In India, for example, orders to block thousands of X accounts sparked a rolling controversy this past month, with some reversals after public blowback. The details are debated. The direction is not. Platform governance is now national security by other means. Ramming, lacing, and water cannoning in the South China Sea used to be occasional crises. They're now recurring programming. Each incident that goes viral erodes patience for engagement-first approaches at home in Manila, Tokyo, and Canberra, and stiffens resolve in Washington and Brussels. Once you accept that the frontier of AI is dual use by default, export controls stop being trade policy and become risk management. The 15% skim deal might prove temporary, but the architecture it reveals, license gates, revenue taps, inspection rights, will outlive today's headlines. EV tariffs were not a spasm. They were a signal that the EU will defend its manufacturing base against subsidized flood-the-zone tactics. Expect more targeted defenses across batteries, solar, and upstream materials. Across democracies, a veto-proof coalition has formed around de-risking. Business lobbies haven't vanished, but they no longer dominate the conversation. Congressional bills, AUKUS reviews, and procurement bans are evidence that the center of gravity shifted. A decade ago, threatening to decouple from China sounded suicidal. In 2025, it's complicated but survivable. With growth moderating and deflationary signals flickering, suppliers from Vietnam to Mexico look less risky, and friendshoring feels less like a press release and more like a purchase order. China still has leverage. It remains the world's workshop for thousands of inputs. It owns a commanding position in clean tech supply chains from polysilicon to battery cathodes. And it can dole out carrots, market access, and sticks, regulatory campaigns, with lightning speed. But 2025's momentum is against it for three reasons. Narrative. The internal detentions of visible figures like Liu Jianchao feed a story of opacity and insecurity at the top. Narratives that make partners hesitant to tie their fortunes to Beijing's whims. Network effects. The more countries standardize on each other for defense tech, AUKUS, energy transition hardware, EU industrial policy, and digital rules, data localization, security laws, the harder it is for China to re-enter those stacks without concessions. Numbers. A property overhang and tricky demographics limit how loud Beijing can turn the stimulus dial without stoking financial risk. That constrains carrots and forces reliance on sticks. And sticks don't build trust. While the South China Sea grabs the viral clips, the real tempo setter is Taiwan. Not because war is likely this month, but because planning for the worst now drives everything from logistics to law. Manila's plain-spoken warning this week that any Taiwan conflict drags the Philippines in laid bare what strategists have whispered for years. If Taiwan blows, the region is a domino of obligations, evacuations, and escalations. That's why you'll keep seeing joint patrols, interoperability drills, and quiet basing upgrades. It's also why Beijing's routine patrols around others' joint exercises are read not as reassurance but as rehearsal. For multinationals, China +1 used to mean PowerPoint. In 2025, it means purchase orders and plant openings. The US just reminded everyone it can pull tariff and licensing levers quickly. Europe is proving it can design sectoral defenses, and India, Southeast Asia, and Mexico are absorbing real production footprints. Even when tariffs spill over, like Washington's new duty on Indian imports, the broader rewiring continues because it's driven by risk calculus more than pure cost. Meanwhile, Chinese firms aren't standing still. They're going upmarket, investing abroad, and finding ways to route around policy walls. But every reroute adds friction or fragility, and neither is good for compounding. You'll hear two pushbacks against this turning on China thesis. Pushback number 1. Markets say relax. Yes, shares rallied in Asia today. Yes, the Nikkei looks perky. Yes, traders think the US and China might roll the tariff truce a bit longer. Markets are forward-looking. They're also notoriously bad at pricing fat-tail geopolitics, until they aren't. A single collision that escalates, a licensing regime that tightens a notch, or a cyber incident traced to a state organ, and the curve reprices in hours. Today's sanguine tape is not a veto on structural de-risking. Pushback number 2. China's scale always wins. Scale is a moat until rules turn it into a target. Europe has shown it can tax the delta created by subsidies. The US has shown it can gate frontier compute, and frontline states have shown they can convert sympathy into alliances. China's scale still matters immensely. It just doesn't automatically win. A short extension, most likely, would buy negotiators time but keep boardrooms tense. A crack, limited hikes that spare some sectors, would widen gray areas. A collapse would cement the belief that 2018 to 2020 wasn't an episode, it was a preview. Watch for who blinks on enforcement of the 15% chip deal and whether new categories sneak into tighter export rules. If water cannons give way to collisions with casualties, mutual defense treaties start breathing louder. Keep an eye on mixed Coast Guard plus Navy deployments and any new joint patrols involving India or European navies. Tariffs were step 1. Expect Brussels to float additional measures on batteries and solar supply chains or explore minimum price regimes to stop subsidy arbitrage. The policy signal matters more than the rate. If Washington's review lands with delays, watch how Canberra and London backfill momentum with bilateral moves, training pipelines, yards, or tech sharing outside the submarine thread. Also watch Australian infrastructure choices around naval choke points. If Liu Jianchao's situation drags on or expands to others, it will spook interlocutors who've banked relationship capital with him. At minimum, it complicates scheduling and slows the very diplomacy China needs more of right now.